Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I want to dedicate this sermon to the members of the Torah on Tuesday class who first helped me have the ideas for it. You're sitting around here dotted about, you know who you are. Thank you. At the very beginning of the arc of the story of Moses, during his first encounter with God at the burning bush, we find him arguing that he's unfit for the task that he's being assigned. He first argues that he's unworthy of what he's being asked to perform, and God deals with that. Then he wants to know how he is going to explain God's identity, and God deals with that. Then Moses wants to know what to do if people won't believe him, the age-old problem of credibility, and God deals with that. And when that's been answered, Moses discloses, as if God doesn't already know about this, if indeed it exists, that, and I quote, "I have never been a man of words. I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue." It's very ironic that in order to do so, he expresses himself in such poetic Hebrew. Lo ish devarim anochi gam mitmol gam mishilshom. It's poetry. It's yet more ironic that the passage is decorated with some extremely ornate notes for Torah readers, such that even as Moses is protesting, he belies himself. Clearly, he knows his way around language. And yet God appears to acquiesce to Moses' fears. According to later on in the Torah, Aaron is going to be the orator to Pharaoh, and Moses is going to channel God to Aaron. And it's only when we begin to move through the Exodus narrative and into the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, that we find Moses being instructed to speak with greater and greater frequency. And it's clear that he does speak. I did a quick search of the words Vayedaber Moshe, and Moses spoke. And I found him talking to the Israelites, who of course don't listen, to God, to Aaron and his sons, and later on, much as I'm doing now, to the whole congregation, except there would be 600,000 of you and it would be hotter. So Moses' problem with speaking would appear to have been resolved. And yet, that problem about speaking is, I suggest, going to return to him with added interest in our Torah portion. We read this morning the famous incident about the rock, which he strikes instead of talking to it as he'd been commanded to do. And our commentators have expended rivers of ink on this frustratingly opaque episode. So Rashi, the famous medieval commentator, but I would add not the only one, teaches us that the fault is that Moses had been told to speak to the rock rather than strike it. In other words, what went wrong was that he didn't listen. Rambam, Maimonides, teaches us that his sin was in his rage. "Listen, you rebels," he shouts. And Ramban, Nachmanides, who never agrees with Rambam on principle, locates the sin in the word, "Shall we bring forth water for you from the rock?" suggesting that any miracle that ensues would have been attributed to Moses and Aaron rather than God, and this, of course, is insubordination on a grand scale. And still there are other explanations. Ibn Ezra says that the fault was in running away from the congregation when they got restive rather than having faith that God would answer their prayers. Or perhaps it was that Moses is still so in grief over his sister's death, which immediately precedes this episode in the Torah, that he simply doesn't know what he's doing and isn't fully in control of his actions. Or perhaps it's that earlier on in the Torah itself, he is instructed to strike a rock so that water will come out of it. And it would be realistic to imagine that if you'd been told once to hit the rock, it would be reasonable to expect that you could do it again. But whatever the rationale that is going to be offered, we have here a moment in which Moses' inability to find words is going to be critical. My colleague from the Ziegler School, Rabbi Rachel Kobrin, observed when she was writing about the parasha this week that sometimes in life, when you make a mistake, The consequences are both significant and irreversible. Or as my grandmother would have said, of Shalom, this is Minnie Cooper, for those of you who know, my grandma of blessed memory taught me there are mistakes you can rectify and there are mistakes that you can't. And Moses' inability to speak to the rock is a mistake that he can't later rectify. He's going to pay very dearly for choosing silence over speech. So why did he do it? I want to suggest that this is the continuation of a pattern that has evolved over the course of the Torah. Moses, at the beginning of the Torah, is a character who prefers action over words. There's only one instance of the words Vayomer Moshe, and Moses said, before the incident at the burning bush, in which he's in conversation with God. And my teacher of blessed memory, Professor Rafal Lowy, would suggest that we should translate those words where they occur, not "and Moses said," but "and Moses thought," since in biblical Hebrew the word Vayomer will do service for both. This week's parashah begins with death. It begins with the episode of the red cow, and within the parashah, Moses loses not only Miriam, but Aaron. And we might imagine him thinking about his life, as we so often do when we lose those who are close to us. Is it that he senses that the arc of his own life is bending towards its close? And in that, is he being drawn back to the creature he essentially is, a man who prefers action over words? We should note that he doesn't protest his punishment in any way. He doesn't speak for the whole of the rest of the parashah. If I can borrow from Shakespeare, the rest is silence. And you see, if that's the case, then what we've got here is the perfect arc of a classical tragedy. We have a man with a fatal flaw, Moses, who has a preference, the flaw, for action over words. Then, early on in the process, he has a transcendent encounter that enables him, at least temporarily, to overcome that flaw. But then there is a crisis, and the flaw, which it now appears never went away, is going to reach out from his past and destroy him utterly. And if we read it that way, then the scene at the rock is the climax of the narrative. It is Moses' tragic fall. And from a tragic fall, as we know from other classical tragedies, there can be no recovery. Again, the rest is silence. But what is interesting, and the point that I'd like us to take home with us to consider, is that that is not the story that the Torah is choosing to tell. We have the incident at the rock at which Moses catastrophically falls. He's beached on his old fault. But it's not going to be the last that we hear from him. This inarticulate man is going to deliver the culmination of the Torah. It is a whole book of soaring monologue entitled Dvarim, words. Those very words that he protested at the burning bush, Lo ish dvarim anochi, I am not a man of words. But there's a book at the end of the Torah that says, yes, you are. The Midrashim on that part of the book tell us that the speech, which ran for about 3 weeks continuously, was heard by each individual of the 600,000 listeners clearly. So this man's reluctant throat is going to swell with words, and the people are going to listen, just as we, year in, year out, listen to what he has to say. So perhaps that scene at the rock is not the tragedy that we imagine it to be. Because yes, Moses is going to be punished for his error, and yes, the punishment is going to be severe. But it's a measure of his greatness and the Torah's wisdom that he emerges from that fall into a triumphant final act in which he's going to overcome his greatest weakness comprehensively. And we might wonder what that might have felt like to him. that this man who hated public speaking is going to feel the mitzvot and the curses and the prophecies and the poetry of the book of Deuteronomy flow out of him. Perhaps, as Rav Kook suggests, he feels the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God, speaking through him. And perhaps, and the ideas don't exclude each other, finally he finds his own voice at the very last, the last possible moment, when everything around him that he knew has died and everything appears to be ending. Perhaps what we can take home from this pattern is that the book of Devarim, the Mishneh Torah, the second Torah, is there to testify to second chances. It's there to teach us that whatever our faults and our flaws, they are not decisive of the ultimate course of our lives. Like Moses, we human creatures have agency and control over our destinies. And what we think might be an ending in our lives might still contain the potential for the words of a new beginning. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.